Hello, grade 4 students. Welcome to a new science lecture video, and we are talking about plants reproduction. Plants are living things. That means that they grow and they reproduce. What do we mean by reproduction? Reproduction is when an organism makes other and new organisms of its same species. Let's say we have an apple tree. An apple tree reproduces by making new apple trees. A pumpkin plant. A pumpkin plant needs to reproduce and to make other pumpkin plants. Let's say a moss plant. A moss plant reproduces by making new mosses. A redwood tree. A redwood tree needs to reproduce and make new redwood trees. How do plants reproduce? There are two different ways. Plants reproduce by making seeds or by making spores. What are examples of plants that make seeds? Flowering plants are plants that grow seeds in their flowers, in the ovaries of their flowers. Conifers are plants that grow seeds in their cones. So flowering plants and conifers are seed plants. They reproduce by making seeds. Plants that reproduce by making spores are mosses, ferns, and fungi. No, fungi are not plants. Pay attention, fungi are not plants. What they have in common with mosses and ferns is that they reproduce by spores. But mushrooms are not plants. So the non-seed plants are mosses and ferns only. Flowering plants and conifers are plants that reproduce by making seeds. Mosses and ferns are plants that reproduce by making spores. Let's go for a quick review about the first lesson, which is the flowering plants. So this was the first lesson in our chapter. And as you know, the reproduction process in flowering plants involves all the parts of a flower. The petals, they are colorful, they are beautiful, and they have a good smell to attract pollinators. The sepals look like leaves and their function is to protect the flower as it is growing. Here we have the anther and the filament. The anther and the filament are parts of the male reproductive organ. The stigma, the style, and the ovary with the ovules inside the ovary are parts of the female reproductive part. The anther with the filament, as I said, build the stamen, while the stigma, style, and ovary make the pistil or the carpel. In order to reproduce, and here I'm taking the example of a perfect flower. Perfect flowers show both the male and the female parts. In order to reproduce, the pollen grain must be taken from the anther of the stamen to the stigma of the pistil via pollinators or pollen helpers. These insects, these animals, the wind, people, water are all examples of pollinators that can take the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. This process is called pollination. So pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Sometimes in plants that grow fruits, fructification happens. What's fructification? Is when the flower becomes a fruit. This is fructification. Conifers are plants that do not make flowers, but they grow cones instead of growing flowers. How do they make seeds? Conifers are evergreen trees. They stay green all year round. They do not lose their green color. They grow needle-like leaves and they grow cones, two types of cones, pollen cones and seed cones. The pollen cones are the male cones and the seed cones are the female cones. The pollen grains needs to be moved from the pollen cones to the seed cones, from the male cones to the female cones. The seed cones, as you can see, are larger than the pollen cones because they are the ones to hold the seeds inside. How does pollination happen? With the help of wind. The wind is the pollinator of conifers. Miss Fatin, what are examples of conifers? Pine, the pine trees, the cypress trees, the redwood trees, the giant sequoia trees, the cedar trees, the fir trees, the redwood trees. All of these are examples of conifers. So till now, you know that flowering plants and conifers make seeds. Then you take the seeds of these plants, you place them in the soil, and new plants grow out of these seeds and reproduction happens. Let's move now for the non-seed plants, mosses and ferns. Mosses are soft plants. They grow in moist places. These plants do not have real roots or real stems or real leaves, and they reproduce by making spores and not seeds. Ferns are plants that do not make flowers at all, but they have leaves called frond. Okay, on the underside of their fronds, they grow spores. Spores help mosses and ferns reproduce. When these spores land on good places with good conditions, they will grow into new moss plants or into new fern plants. What about fungi? Are fungi non-seed plants? No, we cannot consider them as plants. Look at this. Here is a fungus, and as you promised me, when you see a mushroom, a fungus, please don't touch it. Some mushrooms can be deadly, poisonous and deadly. There are different shapes, colors, types of mushrooms. Some of them are edible. We can eat them and they are yummy and rich in minerals, good for the body. Some others are poisonous and deadly. So don't touch a mushroom if you see it in nature. Mushrooms are not plants. They are not animals either. They have a kingdom for themselves. Mushrooms are mushrooms. Fungi are fungi. A mushroom consists of different parts. We have the cap, the gills, the stalk, which is the style, and the mycelial threads that look like roots. Fungi reproduce by making spores. When these spores, fungi or mushrooms reproduce by making spores, as you can see here in the video. When these spores are taken by the water, by the wind, they land on good places with good conditions. They grow into new fungi. So fungi are not plants, but what they have in common with the ferns and the mosses is that they reproduce by growing or making spores. Here you go. We finished the chapter, Miss. What you need to know is, what do we mean by flowering plants? There are plenty of examples of flowering plants, you know, rose plant, strawberry plant, gardenia plant, etc. Pollination is when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma or from a pollen cone to a seed cone. I know that you all know all the parts of a flower, and you know the job of each part. A flowering plant starts as a seed. The seed grows into a seedling. The seedling becomes an adult plant. The adult plant grows flowers, and then the flowers make the seeds. And then the cycle starts all over again. Conifer trees are evergreen trees with needle leaves. Some examples are, as I said, cypress, spruce, cedar, fir, redwood, General Sherman. Pollen cones are smaller than the seed cones. The pollen cones are the male cones and their job is to produce pollen, while seed cones are the female cones and their job is to hold the seeds. Seed plants are the flowering plants and the conifers. Non-seed plants are the mosses and the ferns. Fungi or mushrooms are not plants, but they reproduce by making spores. If you still have any question about anything in this chapter, please ask me. I love you. Bye-bye.